Good evening and happy Monday night to one and all. As you can see, this is the new microphone that I've talked about, but I don't think I actually showed it on screen. I have to be very careful now to kind of moderate the loudness because I do have a pretty significantly loud speaking voice. So I'm going to try to keep the volume at a level where when this plays back, it's not going to be too jarring to the ear. It's tough because I sometimes get fired up, as you all know, like in the Carlos Beltran Hall of Fame episode last week. But I'm at an age where I have to accept the fact that there are certain things during wintertime, and I don't want to say especially in New York, but during wintertime when there is substantial snowfall and maybe icy roads, icy sidewalks and driveways, there are things that I think about now that I didn't have to think about as a younger person. Now, nobody likes to trip on the ice. Nobody likes tripping on the ice. But when you trip on the ice at 21, there is still a pretty good chance that you're going to stand back up and you might be injured, but you're not going to suffer a really terrible injury. Usually not. I know people who have broken their ankle in their 20s, so it is possible. But I also know a lot more people that have mentioned, like, man, I got lucky. I had some fairy dust going. So I am 52 now. I turned 52 at the end of December, as some of you know. And I'm thinking about not only my late father, but also someone he worked with. My father was a CPA, certified public accountant. He went about as far in that business as you can go. He also was somebody who didn't like to hire other people to do jobs he could do himself. He had a different wiring than the average person who has made it. His theory was, I can't hire anybody that'll do a better job than I'll do on my own lawn, etc. So he was somebody who always wanted to shovel his own walk and not hire, neighborhood kids. As much as that's a cliche, that's a real thing. For people in warm climes who don't have to worry about this, it's a real thing. But my dad did not adjust his normal process for winter as he got older. It's not something that he would have thought about. His health was okay. He had some issues in his late 30s related to, he had like what you would call digestive issues, but he made a full recovery. He just had to start eating more fiber. He's from the generation where everything was eggs, meat, milk, eggs, meat, milk, bread, cake, eggs, meat, milk. No broccoli, no carrots, no beta carotene. Beta what? In the 50s and 60s, beta what? But my father, one thing that he loved about wintertime was first me and then my sister and I, and then just my sister. He enjoyed taking us out to kind of do a modified version of what you would call bobsledding. There are some good hills at Bethpage State Park, if you golf fans, or the golf fans among you, where they play the U.S. Open, I guess every 6 or 7 years. But that was a place that people would congregate, and they would have these little toboggans, these little sleds, and they would just go down the hill, and it was an incredible amount of fun. So 30 winters ago, right before the blizzard of 96, which we had the anniversary, the 30th anniversary of the blizzard of 96, my dad took my sister to Syosset Woodbury Park. We lived in the development, which is now called Eagle Rock, off of Jericho Turnpike and just before the Route 135. It was a great location as far as how centrally situated it was, that you were literally 25 minutes from the Midtown Tunnel without traffic. It felt like you could get to 90% of Long Island in less than a 40-minute drive, in some cases even 30. 30 minutes from Manhattan, 20 minutes from Massapequa. It was a perfect spot. But the apartments, it was a lot of money for my dad at the time. He was still paying my mom a shit ton. And he needed to buy his own house, which he was in the process of doing as this story unfolded. So we'd had some snow, but it was not the blizzard of 96 yet. It was the first snowfall. It was like maybe 5 or 6 inches. And my dad decided to take my sister across the street to Syosset Woodbury Park. And about an hour later, I got a phone call on a landline. My dad didn't have a cell phone in 1995, December. He called me on a landline, from the park. He said, I don't even know if I can walk back to the car. I think I just tore my groin. I tripped on the ice and I went up in the air and I landed hard. And I'm just happy. I think I got a bruise, but nothing's broken because I don't think anything's broken. But I think that I ripped my groin and I'm in big trouble here. He says, let me see if I can just get to the car. I'll just walk slow and hopefully I don't trip again. So long story short, he makes it home. We go to the urgent care of December 1995 because it was either a Saturday or a Sunday. I know there was an NFL playoff game. It was the game with the Colts, and I want to say it was Colts versus Bills. And it was a game where Jim Harbaugh was tremendous, but the Bills ended up, the Colts ended up coming up a little bit short. I remember a guy named Zach Crockett had a good game. Great name, Zach Crockett. So we were in the urgent care and he came home. Basically, my dad tore his groin, but he had no other injury except a groin tear. Now, my father was 53 when this happened. He was 53. And yeah, it was a really shitty break. And 7 years later, he had developed a hernia. And he always felt, and he was probably right, that groin injury didn't heal 100%. It weakened the area, and he ended up with a hernia that needed to be fixed when he was 59, going on 60. But the recovery was a really long recovery, and needless to say, he was out of action. He was able to go to work, but he was on crutches. And man, you have a ton of snow and ice as the blizzard of '96 was around the corner. We got hit by like 23 or 24 inches, and the city just got buried. I mean, the city was closed. I remember Giuliani even saying that. He said, people, the city's closed. They needed a day to try to clear off as many of the streets as they could. It was just all bad. But my dad didn't do any shoveling for the rest of that winter. And we were in an area of development. We didn't really have to do very much because they had, you're paying whatever it is per month. Kind of like here, only this is more what you would call full service. But I did some of the shoveling. You had to try to shovel the car out. That was me. And, it didn't really register to me that my dad at 53, maybe it's not the best idea, guy with a high-stress job, a high-stress life, a little bit of a high blood pressure situation, although it was controlled by medication. He doesn't need to be out there shoveling for an hour. He really doesn't. So my father ended up making a full recovery from the groin tear, we thought. But that hernia, I don't think, was an accident. But in 6 weeks, he was back on his feet, and the injury, to his sense, he was okay. He started feeling pain in that general area in about 2000, but he didn't tell anybody. He was the kind of person that didn't want to just go to the doctor for something like that. So, yeah, you know what, I'll be okay. But he started having issues, and then in '02 he had hernia surgery. In 2005, at the age of 62, while vacationing in Florida, and while in Florida, to be with his father, my grandfather, Nathan Cohen, one of the greatest people, that anybody would ever meet. And virtually everyone who met him would say that. He was just one of those special people. Grandpa at the time was 92, and he was having heart surgery. Like, he was a good candidate for heart surgery, even at that age. That's how much of the guy was like a Mack truck crossed with a battering ram. We thought he was going to make it to 100. He made it to 96. My dad went down to Florida. And this is now 2005, so it's about 9.5 years after his disaster of ripping his groin. And he had started having some back issues. Where he had pain that had not been there before. He was a guy who was always nervous. His lower back, he tended to pull muscles anytime he tried to play tennis or basketball. What he needed was a chiropractor in his 30s and 40s, and in that time in history, it just wasn't part of that generation's process to go to chiropractors. My dad thought they were all quacks. No offense. He thought they were quacks. And then later in life, he realized that he had been wrong. But in this instance, his back was bothering him, and he started getting these almost phantom pains coming from his hip, his left hip. And you might also be able to trace it to what had to have been a deep bone bruise. That was not a break. There were not any bone chips, but he had a deep bone bruise. He tore the groin when his feet went up, and when he came down, he landed on the hip. And it was because of his age, and he was still healthy and strong at 53. All he had was a bone bruise. But as he got past his 50s, he started feeling a little bit achier in general. The back was a problem now. He had to be very careful how he got up and sat down. And he had these phantom sensations in his hip. So he went to a doctor, and they didn't give him a bone scan. That was the problem. But they checked him out, and they said, you have some disc erosion in your back. He was at this point probably about a half an inch shorter than at his peak, where he was above 6'1". My father and I were almost the same height. And people who met Dad in his kind of later era, after 2005, they were shocked to find out that he was once over 6 foot, because he already, when you lose height, you get a little bit of kyphosis. You start to just seem like a little old guy. But my father went down to Florida to try to usher his dad to be with his 92-year-old father through his heart surgery, and then, spend a weekend with him convalescing at home in Fort Lauderdale Lakes. What ended up happening is that my father's bones were so brittle that he didn't exactly fall and break his hip. He broke his hip and fell. He had advanced osteoporosis, and when they did the bone scans after his injury, the doctors couldn't believe that he had been walking, a couple of days earlier. That's how bad it was. Those phantom pains was an entire area of his body was about to give way. And it's unfortunate they didn't do a bone scan. They probably would have had to hospitalize him a few weeks earlier to try to give him bone building medication. But the takeaway is that he was in a hospital. He was in traction for 7 weeks. And I don't know how he managed to survive, because there are people after a couple of hours in traction literally say, just put me in a fucking wheelchair. I can't take this. But my father, he was very strong up here. In order to be a CPA, in order to be the kind of person who will be staring at the same bullshit for 8 straight hours and be able to maintain focus. He was a perfect kind of person to be in traction for that reason. So he made 7 weeks in traction, and then he continued his convalescence. Grandpa made a full recovery. My grandfather was just iron. He lived another 4.5 years, and he was still driving a couple of days before he died. It was pancreatic cancer that took him. But Dad, at 62 and then turning 63, as he recuperated from it was hip and spinal fractures. He broke the acetabulum bone of the hip. That is as bad of an injury as you can incur. That's almost as bad as breaking your femur. You're not going to, this is so ghastly. You're not going to bleed to death as easily breaking your acetabulum. But Dad not only broke his acetabulum, but he really fucked up discs in his back. And he got out of traction. He came home. But at this particular time in history, Alan Philip Cohen was 63. And if I may say, the previous decade, he had been able to save a lot of money, because he was no longer paying my mother. Mom got the house. Dad's place in the business was not touched. It was a rare situation where it was an equitable settlement between them. And I think part of the reason why they became such good friends in later era, and why my mother mourned my father when he passed as if they were still together, is that they both brought out the best, sometimes the worst, in one another, but they both did right by each other. And when my dad was in that hospital, my mother, who lived 15 minutes away from my grandfather and not far from the hospital, she visited him on average 6 days a week. And that meant so much to him, but also to her. They both took turns apologizing to one another in a way that indicated they both fucked up. They weren't supposed to be a couple that split after 20. They were supposed to go the distance, and each in their own way was a little bit immature. But that's besides the point. He made as much of a full recovery as you could, but he was now about 5'9", maybe. He lost about 4 inches of height in this insane ordeal. So He and his two partners, my dad was the youngest of the three, one of whom, Mr. Schulman, is still alive. And I think he still works a partial schedule. The guy is in his upper 80s. It's fucking crazy. He looks incredible, though. Mr. First has passed. But my father and his two partners, with Dad being out of commission for months, he was able to work. This was the early days of connecting to the office network with various, broadband of the day. He was able to do some work, but the guys were nervous, and they started the process of merging SCF and Co. with a bigger firm. And that's what they ended up doing. They merged with a larger firm, and by the time the merger went completely through, it was like October, November of 2005. And I remember driving Dad into the city a number of days as we were getting stuff from his previous office, which was at, I think it was at West 45th Street between 5th and 6th Avenue. That was where they had moved. He was in when he was younger, he was in the Empire State Building, then he was in the Chrysler Building, then he was in the Empire State Building again, then he was at 370 Mad, then he was in the Daily News Building, that was amazing. But then he was at 99 Park, which was also amazing. Man, the rent back then was out of control. I can't even imagine now. So as 2005 came to a close, my father, who had been, first he was on crutches, and then he was on, he used a walker for a couple of days, but then he realized he didn't need the walker. He just needed a cane. And before you knew it, he didn't need the cane. But he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. He walked with a limp for the rest of his life. So literally for the next, 15 plus years, he walked with a limp. Man, he was only 63. It's crazy that he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. After the merger was completed, and I got to meet the managing partner. I'm not going to name the company, but you could probably guess, one of the biggest in the city. I have mentioned them before. I'm not telling you to comb through previous episodes, but for the purposes of this one, I can't name the episode. You'll see why. Excuse me, I can't name the firm. So when an accountant, it could be a lawyer, it could be a stockbroker with, estate planning and financial planning clients, when you merge with a larger firm, in the manner of these guys, the intention is that you are going to slowly retire, and then you'll draw like a consultancy fee for the next number of years. That's the part that gets negotiated, because you're bringing your business. Let's say, for argument's sake, that you merge with a firm that has $100 million in what you would call sales. It's not really sales in accounting. It's billable time, but it's the same concept. Let's say you merge with a firm that has $100 million in sales, and you bring somewhere between $2 and $3 million in a given year. Well, that's very attractive, especially if a couple of the partners have cash cow clients that generate enormous billing. And my dad had two clients that you never stop billing them, and both of those guys never complained about the bill. They always paid on time, and they would tell anybody, use these guys, use Alan if you can. Because, yeah, he's expensive, but he's worth his weight in gold. Dad was really good at this. So one of the things that he was doing when the merger went through and all of his stuff was in the new place was there was a particular CPA who was either 52 or 53, right in my age bracket, who was going to take the lead on Dad's biggest clients. This is normal, standard practice. Now, I didn't know this at the time, but the way that it was explained to me, my father and Mr. Schulman, when we, just having lunch on a random day, the way he explained this, he said, yeah, so a couple of the younger partners are going to start, we're going to siphon our work more and more to them. And by like 2010, we'll be completely retired, and we'll probably get monthly stipends, the consultancy fee for at least 5 or 6 years. So that was how it was supposed to go. So my father met this gentleman who lived not that far from where we lived, and I never had the opportunity to meet this gentleman. My dad met with him a bunch of times. They went over the parameters of this client requires this kind of, you have to have a mindset where it's going to be a way higher percentage of auditing than taxes, but this client, whatever it is. So this guy was going to start to take over these two whale accounts. And there was a snowstorm in early 2006. It was a big snowstorm. And I remember I got home I don't know if I got home from the gym, but I remember getting home and my father had a look on his face like he couldn't believe the news that he had just received. This gentleman, who was a runner, he was a fitness guy, died of a heart attack while shoveling snow that night. And Dad was just, his face had just become ashen. He had just been with the guy like the day before. How could he be gone? How is this possible? The guy didn't have a history of heart problems. So like yesterday, I'm kind of joking around a little bit about the fact that where I live here, it's full service where they do everything, but we pay a lot in HOA fees. But somebody like me at my age, yeah, I'm a fitness guy too, but I feel like if you're over 50, you just shouldn't be shoveling snow, you know? So this gentleman passed. And, you know, I've unfortunately been to my share of wakes and my share of memorial services. Maybe not as much as you have, but I've been to my share. And there are those where the person maybe died unexpectedly, but they lived a good life. They got as much out of life as they realistically could, such as my father, even though he didn't make it to 80. For 79, he got a lot more out of life than he probably imagined as a younger person. His father made it to 96. Nathan Cohen, it must be said, got more out of life than the next 999 people. But this guy was still in his prime. He had another 15 years working at peak efficiency, most likely. And suddenly he was gone. And I remember going to the funeral home and nobody knew what to say, because what can you say? It was horrendous. And, you know, meeting the partners under these now dire circumstances, and nobody's joking around. There were tears, and, you know, the two managing partners of this firm had really difficult, they both had horrendous days because they had to tell everybody. They had to tell everybody. And it's awful. It's like George Steinbrenner having to personally call, you know, in the pre-cell phone internet era, having to call everybody when he got word first that Thurman Munson had passed in August of 79. So these two guys had horrible days. And when they did the service as quickly as possible, I think it was the following night, they were exhausted, but they made a 2.5-hour drive to the funeral home. And it was so bad. And honestly, this was the first story that I heard of a person that I was aware of dying like this. 52, 53 years old. Let the kids do it. You know, I'm not going to do more than a couple of shovels ever again, and not just because I'm here. You know, if that makes me a wimp and I should try to tough it out, yeah, physically I could do it. It's the same way as me saying, yeah, physically I could still deadlift 300 plus, but I'm going to end up in the hospital. I'm most likely not going to die. I'll just end up in a hospital with, you know, lower lumbar super strain. You know, I can't even imagine what would happen if I just went in there and tried to do that. So the overall point, other than giving you some illumination on my father at ages that were first similar to me, and then his partner, one of the many partners that he had in that firm, who he just went out to shovel snow like we do all the time. And what I'm saying is, when you see people on TV, you know, you see like a Sanjay Gupta kind of guy, you know, like a doctor who works for a network. It doesn't matter what network. When they say, we urge caution for older people when shoveling, don't shovel for more than 5 minutes at a time. There's just too many things that could go wrong. Even if it feels easy, maybe it's not, because you don't know how taxing it is on the strongest muscle, the heart. And that guy should not have passed. And he did. He would be 72, 73 now. It's tragic. It was tragic. So as much as we can kind of poke fun at people who, you know, kind of retired from shoveling, I get it. It makes sense. And that's really what I wanted to say. I'm sorry for being depressing, but, you know, sometimes when you see these sorts of storms, and as I was driving around before, and by the way, I should also point out, they did a great job on the roads. I mean, they really did, and I'm not getting paid by Suffolk County. They really did a great job in this development. They did a great job in general in Suffolk County. But when you see, when you hear, whether it's social media or whether it's just a neighbor, you see an older person, if you're a kid, if you're a younger person, just ask if they could use a little help. Because you don't want anything catastrophic to take place. And man, not something that I ever imagined. And it happened. My father couldn't have imagined tearing his groin and probably sustaining permanent damage to his hip that was not going to actually come to anything for many years to come. But then trying to recover from horrible hip and back fractures and recovering, and then gearing up for retirement, and then the person who was going to take over his big accounts is gone. The guy was how many years younger than Dad? He was 9, 10, 11 years younger than my father. So yeah, make sure that you tell your loved ones that you love them, and be nice to yourself. Don't push too hard. I would even say if you're over 40, don't push too hard when it comes to shoveling, please. And I know if my dad could do it again as a younger person, he would have been okay with neighbors' kids, age 15, hooking them with a $10 bill. Will you kids take care of this? Now I know that he would. He kind of had to come around. He was a guy who liked to clean his own house. And I hate to say he was shamed into hiring people, but he was shamed into hiring people. But he didn't regret it, because he didn't need to be doing that when he was 65 years old. He didn't need to. Sorry, Dad. He didn't need to be on his hands and knees scrubbing his toilet, in my opinion. So he learned some lessons that were hard lessons. And I hope that I don't suffer similar fates. I'm very, very careful. Some of you see me when I do a ton of reps with very light weights, and I feel secure, I feel strong, I feel like I'm being safe, and that's really the best we can do. This time of year can be very dangerous. You don't want to trip. My mom's father broke his ankle in the late 70s. He also wasn't really that old when that happened. He was in his early to mid 60s, and he was not careful with how he was walking, and he went down, and that was one of the toughest men to ever live. Baron Breitkopf, the mobster, he was a leg breaker in the Jewish mob. He was in a lot of pain. He wouldn't want you to know if he was tearing up because it hurt so much, but he might have been. Anyway, mild apologies for this unconventional episode. I hope that it was still entertaining and informative for you. But when you have weather like this, and my cousin in Jersey got 18 plus inches, we got probably about 8 or 9. But it didn't really snow very much after a certain point yesterday. We got a lot of sleet and freezing rain. So, but that's all I wanted to say. Just be careful. Enjoy the beauty of the season, but don't take any unnecessary risks. And please, when you're out walking, especially at night, make sure the ground under you is ground and not ice. Peace.